Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, BC joins the Freelander war effort, despite the pulsing drugs and swirling schemes of Krona, the Four Families, and the threat of the Freelanders themselves. Wade into the fury of war next on the Seventh Valkyrie. Chapter 33. Something on the Wind. BC. The 21st day of winter. Second hour of the Rene conflict. The woman who many called Nightmare sat cross-legged on what had been the underside of an overturned wagon, watching the battle unfold around her as the forces of the old city pushed against the steady lines of ironclad Edaran resistance on the third level of the new city. The wagon was on fire. Or at least it was on fire everywhere except for where the girl sat, gazing out through black eyes and completely unaffected by the heat or the pain of the flames. There were 3 reasons that she had chosen such a spot. First, it was one of the only free places to sit down. Second, it made it easier to ignore Rene, who kept asking questions about BC's power and why she wasn't using it more. Third, 8 different Freelanders had tried to kill her between the bottom of the staircase and the second floor landing, and that was without mentioning the hails of arrows from the Edarans. The fire served as a deterrent to killers from both cities, concealing her from Edaran arrows and striking some semblance of fear into any Freelander who knew it was good for them. Reaching into her pocket, BC fished out the last ferret in her wallet and held it out slightly beyond her hand, where she watched it ignite, inhaled it, and breathed in and out smoke indistinguishable from that of the burning wagon. Troublingly, her buzz didn't change, not one bit, even as she burned the ferret down to the nub in one massive toke and flicked it. She needed something heavier. Frowning, BC dug into her other pocket, looking for another pinch of moon dust, some blitz powder, a bite of frenzy plant. She would have even taken a fireball or dagger dust at this point, but no, she was completely out of drugs. That was never a good thing, but with Scene's power pulsing through her, running dry was even more dangerous. When Scene's power was this active, there was little chance that she would OD. She had tested it once, actually, back in the pleasure pits of Mandus. And rather than going out in a blaze of glory, all that she had gotten from her suicidal cocktail of drugs was a bloody mess of bodies for Krona to clean up, sore insides, and the worst crash-down hangover of her entire life. She'd been so depressed and exhausted that she hadn't had the will or the capability to kill herself, despite the pain that desperately made her want to do so. No, ODing wasn't the danger here. BC was. Pumping through her body now was some force of oblivion unknown even to the Freelanders, foreign even to Krona's infinite knowledge. BC reached out into the flames again, but even though they licked against her, she didn't feel their heat, their pain, and even the hair on her arms remained untouched. Sliding towards the edge of the burning wagon, BC had an idea, and shoved her hand along the jagged splinters of wood, wincing as 3 remained in her hand, drawing fresh blood. But rather than pull them out, she mashed her hands together, driving the splinters deeper into her flesh until she could feel tears running down her face, which was a purely physical reaction to the self-inflicted wounds. But then she winced, ever so slightly. That was a good thing. If drugs didn't work, pain could help keep her from slipping into a full blackout. As she tried to get to her feet, the wagon collapsed underneath her, leaving her stumbling and sliding unceremoniously out of the flames. Krona would have had a million little quips ready if he'd been there, but he had kept to his word and had not followed the charge of the Freelanders onto the second level or beyond. At one point in the heart of the battle for the second staircase, BC had seen the lights of the barge, but there had been no sign of the Darksteel battlecraft. That didn't mean that Krona was done here for the evening. He was probably hiding underwater or observing some other part of his plan. But he wasn't here, and that meant that neither were his hard drugs, so she'd have to get creative with pain. BC stomped on the rubble of the wagon, splintering out a jagged fragment of wood, still burning. Tearing it completely from the wagon, BC took a deep breath, angled it along her side, and then pierced her abdomen, entering 6 inches right of her belly button and pushing until the burning stake broke the skin and exited out her back. To anyone watching, it took a little over a second, but to BC, by the time the stake emerged back out into her dampening undershirt, Scene had danced with every single drug in her system for a full song. Every flame danced with 1,000,000 colors, every face with 1,000 familiar ones, and at once BC was thrust into feelings of living memory, out-of-body bliss, strange skews of sexual frustration, an intense sensation like her body was a city burning with the screams of 1,000 lives, and finally some blend of determination, satisfaction, perversion, utter zen, and a bad need to snack on some food. Then she vomited, and then she screamed, and then she breathed in, as the overpowering clarity that came from shock and adrenaline in her system finally overrode all the bullshit clicking around in her head. Her heart was pounding so quickly she'd have been concerned about a heart attack if she hadn't been relieved at the same time. It was pain, it was nausea, it was agony, but it was all still real. She could still come down, avoid totally blacking out and falling into Scene's oblivion. She just had to drink it all in. Fuck, all of it. Everything around her, the death and despair, every sensation. It was that or slip away. With incredible determination, BC pressed against her side, putting blinding pressure onto the wooden stake. She fell to one knee, eyes wide open and streaming with tears as she scanned the battlefield. To the outsider, she looked to be ducking down from the fire and scanning for her next target. But on the inside, the scattered feelings and thought patterns that made up the normal BC struggled to reassert themselves. An uncaring numbness emanated always from the depths of her tattoos, responding to pain or stimulation with more and more and more oblivion power. So, BC pressed harder against her wound, focusing on her own agony, the screams around her, and the deep hatred that filled the air, the hatred that had turned even gentle faces and old acquaintances into the destructive instruments of war. She drank in the solemn sight of storefronts turned to ashes, of homes lost, bodies that already littered the streets. Veteran and Freelander, she dwelled on each fallen form that would never return home, on the children whose parents would weep tonight, the mothers and fathers who had left orphaned families behind. BC hissed out, shoving the air from her body and breathing in the fear and the emotions. She riled up the drugs and the substances inside her, daring them to take hold of the raw emotions, to spiral out and clash, cause bad trips, fill every fiber of her being, anything to avoid slipping away into Scene's void. BC gasped in agonizing pain, and that was just a sign to press harder. The agony was a sign that Scene was receding, and she could see her tattoos drawing back, unblackening her fingernails and retreating up her arm, with its splintering tributaries starting to fade. BC readjusted, driving the stake even harder as she fought to pull Scene back under control, to battle back from the turning point. When that sweet oblivion swept over her, it could wash into the deepest corners of her mind, numb her so blissfully, take root so deeply that it could take months before the husk that was Nightmare faded and it all came crashing back down on BC. With one fist clenched, BC returned her gaze to the battle raging around her, searching every cobble, every window, every flickering shadow and fire to hold on to the brutality, the sadness, the sensations of what surrounded her. She tried to breathe it, feel it, smell it, taste it with every fiber of her being, drinking in the misery. dying soldiers who were half burned alive, impaled, disemboweled, or missing limbs were wrestling over weapons, fighting to make sure their enemies died first rather than for their own survival. Their screams and curses and wails of despair and pain, the sickening sounds of flesh tearing and spilling, it filled BC's ears and she savored it. It was the first time she had truly heard anything since activating Scene on the wharf. Gasping, BC held her eyes and her ears open, fighting desperately again to be present, to witness and experience what surrounded her despite the whirlwind of drugs stimulating, slowing, dumbing, numbing, lifting, downing, upping, and confusing her. The strength she needed to keep the stake pressing into her side was fading, and when she had given all of her strength to that effort, she bit down so hard her teeth creaked. But it was working. The tattoos receded, and BC hyperventilated, trying to suck in the very essence of the world as the emptiness reached out to beat it back from inside her. Unlocking her jaw, BC heard the sound of babbling words, and quickly realized that they had come from her own mouth, so long silenced by Scene's power that she'd forgotten when or why she had started speaking. Clawing further, BC spoke, and told the story of the carnage she was experiencing over and over to herself in words. There was a wagon torn apart and strewn with boiling corpses where late traveling citizens had been caught, captured, overturned, and burned alive. There were shrieks of the sick and the elderly crying out through the windows of buildings where they'd been left, either abandoned to the fires or unable to escape after the misguided Edoran celebrations had turned to a night of death. There were brief flashes of hope. A young boy sneaking free and escaping into the night with a smoke-covered puppy in his arms. A pair of lovers making it to the safety of the Edoran line through the luck of Apostolos. But those little victories were shallow, too shallow, and they were drowned out by the sound of those who hadn't been fast enough, healthy enough, wealthy enough, or loved enough to escape. It was brutal and raw, and with tears streaming down her face, BC fought to bear witness. But this time the tears came not from an involuntary physical reaction, but from the hurricane of emotions fighting to be felt inside of her. BC stood, looking down to see that her tattoos had receded nearly to her wrist. There was still time to leave. She had done her job. The tide had turned. The battle would still bring death, but with an advantage like this, Rene didn't need BC. Neither did Zale or Krona, or whichever the fuck he was more of right now. Where was Rene? Where was... She at least needed to know that she didn't have her weapon anymore. BC owed her that much, but as BC surveyed the street, she didn't see the sandglass blade anywhere. Instead, her eyes settled on the gaps between the buildings, where she met the eyes of a young girl, maybe in her early 20s, and the 3-year-old daughter in her arms as they emerged from the alleys, an Edoran soldier shouting and shepherding them forward. BC froze, shaking her head at the young mother to stay hidden. But instead of recognition or acknowledgement in the mother's eyes, BC saw only a terrifying expression of horror. And then, BC saw the flames erupt from the alleyway behind them. BC did not see the soldier burn, but she heard the mother scream, in equal parts desperation and despair as she tried to shield her daughter from the torrent of flame that engulfed them. And BC did not hear the young girl shrieking for her mother, though she could see the girl's mouth moving. BC couldn't even hear her own screams at the pursuing Freelanders, begging them, demanding that they hold their fire. But BC could see just fine as the little girl's eyes met her own, full of a fear and desperation the little girl was too young to even understand. And then, all BC could see was the fire, as the rampant warriors unleashed another torrent of flame across the mother and her daughter. As As the rampant warriors arrived at the two bodies, BC's perception turned and twisted and tore apart. BC couldn't see the skin flaking off of the girl, or the slight rise and fall of her charred back, which showed she still lived, too burned to even scream. BC did not hear the sound of the men realizing what had happened, and though they were right in front of her, she couldn't see the rise of a warrior's boot above a child's half-melted head as the warriors made some far too late attempt to offer mercy. But BC could smell the girl's seared hair and taste her splintering skull as she died. Letting out a voiceless plea, BC finally shattered under the weight of unspeakable horror and gave herself over to the one power that might end the pain. And with that single, desperate, unspoken prayer to the only God she knew, BC felt nothing at all. Hey there! If you're hearing this, it means you're listening to the public version of this episode. I appreciate you taking the time and your interest in the series. It really helps the algorithm, it helps us grow. But if you are enjoying the show, maybe take a look over at our Patreon. We have uncut versions of the early episodes, access to new chapters before they're released for the general public, and you can shape the future of the series by deciding on new merch drops, bonus content, and more. You can get started for free at patreon.com/Seventh Valkyrie. That's patreon.com/7THVALKYRIE. Hope to see you there.